Hey everybody, welcome to session 146 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. This is also the 6th edition of the Inside JABA Series. I'm joined today by Inside JABA regulars, Drs. Linda LeBlanc and Claire St. And we are joined by a special guest, Dr. Jesse Dallery from the University of Florida. And in today's episode, we're talking all about public health, and in particular, the paper that Jesse and his colleagues just published in the latest issue of JABA. It's a journal, not a podcast. All right, so this paper fits nicely in with JABA's ongoing series on public health and telehealth. And it's a great example of the potential for behavior analysis to be used for so much more than the type of work many BCBAs are doing currently. As Linda states during the show, public health is something that's just all around us, and that public health challenges at the end of the day are behavioral in nature. And smoking is just a prime example of that. As an aside, if you're not currently subscribed to JABA, go to behavioralobservations.com for the show notes for this episode and start your subscription today. You can get it in print or in just an e-version. The link for that will be in today's show notes. So in today's show, we talk about the following topics: the current scope of cigarette smoking in the United States, how cigarette smoking occurs disproportionately in individuals of lower socioeconomic status, previous research in the contingency management of cigarette smoking, the logistical challenges of previous work in contingency management, how Jesse and his research team address these challenges in the current study by developing a mobile system of carbon monoxide sampling, and the relationship between the literature of contingency management and delayed discounting, and more generally, behavioral economics. As with previous Inside JABA Series podcasts, this one is eligible for approved continuing education. So go to behavioralobservations.com/getCEUs to learn more. And while we're on the topic of CEUs, allow me to suggest subscribing to the Behavioral Observations Patreon page, where enrolled patrons get access to discounts in the Behavioral Observations CEU store, as well as other purveyors of behavior analytic training. So to learn more about that, head on over to patreon.com/behavioral observations. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this 6th edition of the Inside JABA Series.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Inside JABA Series. We're up to number 6 already. Can you believe that? I'm here with my regular co-hosts, Drs. Linda LeBlanc and Claire St. And we're joined by a special guest, Dr. Jesse Dallery from the University of Florida. So welcome, everyone. How's everyone doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Matt.
Doing great. Thanks, Matt, for being with us again.
Great. We've got a lot to talk about today. We can talk about behavior analysis and continuing kind of the public health conversation. Jesse, you've done some really interesting work in this arena. What I'm going to do is just turn the questioning over to Linda and Claire here in just a minute, because they're familiar with your work and they've prepared some really interesting questions. I'm looking forward for those guys to get into that. But first, just for the benefit of the audience, for those who are not familiar with your work, could you take a minute or two and just kind of tell us a little bit about what you do, where you do it, your research and professional interests and things like that? That would be a great way to kind of kick this off.
Sure, yeah. So right now I'm a professor in psychology in the behavior analysis area at the University of Florida. And I've been here now for 20 years. Which still surprises me to say. I'm also a licensed psychologist here in the state of Florida. My work revolves around technology-based tools to assess and treat a range of unhealthy behavior, physical inactivity, medication non-adherence, but especially smoking cessation. And I got to say, I'm really excited about technology. Hopefully that'll come through in various ways. It's not a panacea, of course, but it can bring behavior analytic methods and treatment to new areas in really kind of unprecedented ways. So just kind of one example, technology can repeatedly assess and provide reinforcers in real time for most health behavior. And I'm also interested in quantitative modeling of choice and operant behavior in the human lab.
Very good. So I know you could probably go on quite a while because I know you've got quite the body of work, but maybe we can have you back on to talk about some of the stuff in more detail later on. But I want to get to the kind of heart of the podcast here, and you've got a new paper in the upcoming issue of JABA, Motivate, a smartphone-based contingency management intervention to promote smoking cessation. Okay, let me try to get all those words out again. That's a lot of syllables. Anyway, so this is I had a chance to preview the paper, and it's a really interesting use of technology. And so I think what I'm going to do again is turn it over to Claire and Linda and have them ask you all sorts of questions about it. So
Sounds great.
Yeah, why don't you guys go ahead and have at it?
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse, for joining us today. I'm excited to see this paper come out in the next issue of JABA as part of our special series on public health and telehealth. Although this isn't exactly what we think of as telehealth, it certainly is a technology-enhanced healthcare delivery, and it's absolutely right in the wheelhouse of public health. For our listeners who are less familiar with that term in that field of public health, how do you define it? What's that scope of what we think of as public health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pretty big scope. Public health as a field is vast. It covers epidemiology, biostatistics, environmental health, health promotion and education, and also the social and behavioral sciences. But the common thread is a focus on improving the health of entire communities, large groups of individuals. That could be local neighborhoods or whole regions of the world. And also there's a focus in public health on promoting healthcare equity and accessibility.
Great. So certainly it seems like the efforts over the last decades to get people to maybe know those food groups, eat well, exercise, 30 minutes of cardio several times per week. The fact that we know these sound bites speaks to the fact that public health is all around us, trying to give us a message that might influence our behavior. Would you agree with that? Not that I'm being a lawyer here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. I think, the ubiquity of those messages speaks to the fact that, public health is all around us. And so are many unhealthy decisions that many people make routinely.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is like the messaging is there, but so is the maladaptive behavior. So it is not the case that messaging alone appears to be sufficient, which is probably not a surprise to any behavior analyst,
right.
But probably sometimes makes a splash in the public health arena that the education piece of this in isolation is not necessarily enough.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah. So education is a big part of public health, but it's maybe necessary but insufficient, and maybe just insufficient. I was stunned to see that in your article, you said an estimated 35 million people still smoke, and that smoking is still one of the leading causes of premature death. But I absolutely can remember since I was a kid, it being well known, lots of education efforts out there to try to get people to stop smoking. And it seems like those public health efforts really ramped up over time. What kinds of things have been done in the public health arena to try to get people to stop smoking? And why haven't they worked as well as we might hope?
Yeah, all great questions. That number of 35 million is stunning. And that's just in the United States. What that translates into is about 500,000 people are going to die prematurely this year in the United States. I do want to point out about these numbers. It's it's also true that over the past 50 years, these numbers have gone down quite a bit as a result of public health intervention. So whereas in mid 1950s or so, about 45% of the population smoked cigarettes. So now it's down to about 14%. But one thing these numbers kind of don't illustrate is that, way back when, smoking was kind of equal opportunity. It happened across SES, socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic groups. But now, really, smoking is a chief health disparity in the United States. So it affects disproportionate numbers of the poor, racial, ethnic, sexual minorities, least educated, those with mental health issues. But yeah, it's definitely decreased. Some of those public health measures, some of them have been education. When it was first discovered that smoking does lead to early death, that led to the Surgeon General's warning on cigarette packs of cigarettes. There've also been some public health measures regarding increasing the price of cigarettes, and adolescents are very sensitive to price. Adults, not so much, but adolescents, yes. And that's when people start to smoke as adolescents. Smoking bans, and also behavioral and pharmacological treatment. The other part of your question was, well, why is it still a problem? Yeah, that's a really big question. I think one big part of that has to do with the fact that tobacco companies spend about $25 million a day in the United States on advertising.
Oh my God. Let me just,
Yeah.
A day.
Per day, just in the United States on advertising. I can't remember the exact number of what that works out to per person, but per year it's something like $250 per person in the United States. And it's also the case that the marketing is very targeted. It's targeted to teens. It's also targeted to specific racial and ethnic groups. So that's a big factor. I think, there are other operant processes like imitation, seeing parents and others do it, social reinforcement, the way in which the advertising works, it really appeals to teens being accepted. Social reinforcers are very important for teenagers. So that they all kind of coalesce together, all those sort of processes. And then, once dependent on smoking, it's really hard to stop. Many of the smokers we see, they smoke 20 cigarettes a day for about 20 years.
And you mean it's biologically hard, like there are physiological effects associated with withdrawal that make it very unpleasant.
Right, absolutely, yeah. So all those negative reinforcement processes, the withdrawal it's very hard. And just, thinking about all that momentum, behavioral momentum associated with doing something 20 times a day, and, each cigarette requires a number of puffs, and it's a lot of momentum to disrupt. And adding on to that, right, the withdrawal, other life stressors that really impact the reinforcing value of smoking.
And if you're actually smoking that many cigarettes a day and taking those puffs, there are also accompanying thoughts that you're experiencing even more than 20 times a day, potentially hundreds of times a day. These automatic thoughts and really almost craving experiences that could really make you vulnerable to relapse, even if you do begin the not so pleasant process of quitting. Right,
absolutely. And across the board for all treatments for smoking, and this is true also for drug dependence, most relapse several times after quitting. It's led to the view sort of that drug dependence, including smoking, is a chronic relapsing behavioral problem.
Well, at least we have some treatment, like what you're trying, contingency management.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that is it kind of a dim view of the world? And I suppose there's many reasons to have a dim view of the world right now. But this is a huge problem in, behavior analysts, I think as a whole, like to be socially engaged. We like to solve problems. And when you talk about the amount of complexity of these behavior chains, the interplay of probably respondent and operant processes, it seems like this might be an insurmountable problem, but it turns out the behavior analysts have been pretty active in this area for some time now. And you've certainly, as Matt alluded to earlier, had a large impact in the area of smoking cessation and in the use of contingency management. But not everybody may be familiar with that term, right? So I don't know, if you're a master's level BCBA, if you might not have had much, if any, exposure to the term contingency management or that literature in your training. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what contingency management is and why we should consider it as an approach, like what might be some of the advantages of contingency management over some other treatment approaches. We've already maybe talked about some of the disadvantages of education alone, but that's probably not the only thing out there either.
Yeah. So, probably all applied interventions can be considered contingency management in one form or another, but the term really kind of came out of the substance abuse community, the substance abuse verbal community, and it's we call it CM for short. And it's actually, one of the most successful translations of behavior analysis to treat problem behavior of any kind. It involves providing desirable consequences, usually financial incentives, based on objective evidence of drug abstinence. Most cases, the objective evidence, it's biochemically confirmed. Actually, all cases. It's biochemically confirmed with urinalysis. You have clean urine, for example, no metabolites of the drug, or with breath-based devices like a breathalyzer for alcohol, for example, or a smokerlyzer for smoking. Most of the time, CM is used to promote abstinence from illicit drugs like cocaine and heroin. That's the most common applications. But increasingly smoking. I know we'll talk more about that later. One thing about CM, it sounds simple, right? It's providing desirable consequences based on abstinence. And that sounds simple, but there's actually a lot to it. There are a lot of science-based ingredients that go into CM. So, the schedule of reinforcement, the immediacy of the reinforcer, all of these parameters have to be carefully thought about and tailored based on the evidence, the literature.
And Jesse, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Not only about the components, but about, do you think that the stuff that's been done on getting people to exercise more or eat differently, does that also fall under this contingency management umbrella, or has that term, like coined CM, kind of really been used in the substance literature?
Right. It's a good question. It was certainly coined in the substance abuse literature. I think now the term has started to be applied towards some other target behaviors like eating, physical activity, medication adherence, for example. So, right. I think it has started to broaden outside of the substance use literature.
Yeah. And then in terms of like the components of contingency management, how often, like it is pretty technical. You shouldn't just jump into this without some experience. And one of the things that I've seen in many of these articles on contingency management is that people really perceive the reset of contingencies as aversive.
Yeah.
And I wondered, like you just have to take that into account when you're designing it.
That's right. Yeah. So the reset refers to a property of the schedule of reinforcement in most CM interventions. So the idea is that as you stay abstinent, the value of the incentives gradually increases. So for example, you may start at $3, and then the next time it goes up to $3.25, and it keeps on increasing. But if you lapse or miss a sample, that schedule resets. So you may be abstinent for quite a while, and maybe you're up to $15. But then if you lapse, that schedule goes down. It starts all over again. And people do find that aversive. So there is a bit of a loss aversion dimension built into the schedule. But so the logic does make some sense. The longer you're abstinent, the more you have to gain, and the more you have to lose if you lapse. So there are data supporting the efficacy of this kind of schedule, this escalating schedule, the reset, relative to other kinds of schedules, like just doing the same amount each and every time. So they may find it aversive, but it turns out it seems to work the best.
And you might be able to see why that would be important. Just doing a quick callback to what you mentioned when you introduced the problem of smoking, which is that we're combating tremendous reinforcement histories of a behavior being associated with a wide array of social and physiological reinforcers.
Right.
So having something that is an added push to have repetition and sustaining of building a new habit might be a particularly important component, because you've got to override so much of what has happened historically.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a great way to think about it. Is we need a huge point of leverage to overcome that long history and current circumstances. These individuals are still living in the natural environment. They're not in inpatient treatment. And so we're overriding history and current circumstance as well.
Do you know of any studies that have looked at I know that contingency management has a wide array of efficacy across a lot of different substance use types and populations. Does history play a role? Is it easier to do this with people who have a shorter history of substance use than a longer history? Or is it such a powerful intervention that doesn't matter? Or do we not know?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer with respect to history in terms of number of years, say, smoking. There are some data with respect to degree of dependence on, say, nicotine. Also, your rate of smoking, just as indicated by a breath carbon monoxide sample, which is our measure of how much someone smoked recently. Those do seem to predict outcomes.
And I've also seen data that the number of different substances that you have abused negatively predicts successful outcome.
Jesse,
go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I know there's some overlap in the kind of behavioral economics, delayed discounting community and the contingency management, literature or community, or whatever you want to call it. I'm wondering if there was, just one of the things that occurred to me, kind of going off some of the more recent questions here is, would there be any kind of hypothetical, choice task or demand task or whatever that would predict someone's response to treatment? So if you put them through some sort of delayed discounting procedure, would that be predictive, in terms of one's, treatment outcome with regard to a CM intervention?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a few studies that have actually looked at that, looked at degree of delay discounting at baseline. And the idea there is that delay discounting is a measure of how fast a reinforcer loses value as the delay to its receipt increases. So something far out in time is going to lose a lot of value relative to something that you're going to get today. And so there are some data to show that there is a weak predictive relationship. We have some data, though, where we have not seen that relationship. So I wonder how many negative results are out there, file drawer kind of problem results that are out there. it's a really interesting question. People have thought about ways of maybe tailoring the treatment based on degree of delay discounting at baseline, and that may work to some extent. But one thing that kind of, to me, is a very useful feature of CM is that it works regardless of just about any individual difference. So if you think about what might predict success, income, but there is no relationship between income and success under CM. It seems to work just kind of across the board, which is a nice feature of the intervention. But yeah, we need more data, I think, is probably the bottom line with respect to delay discounting. There are some studies out there suggesting that there is a predictive relationship, but I think we would need to see more and include the negative results in the analysis as well.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and just as an aside for folks listening to the show, we've done quite a few shows in the back catalog about delay discounting. So if you want to get up to speed on those, I'll include links to those in the show notes. But just look for any shows did a couple of shows with Derek Reed and more recently David Cox, and kind of further back in the catalog, Aaron Rasmussen. So those are a few people you can look up to get the lowdown on all things behavioral economics. So anyway, please, guys, continue.
Yeah. So, Jesse, I know you've done a good bit of research on contingency management. Certainly, Ken Silverman and the group at Hopkins, and I know that you trained with some of those folks, they've done a lot of work on contingency management, usually to treat more illicit substance abuse. Right. And obviously, if you can stop using either these illicit substances or stop smoking or drinking, what have you, there are potentially a lot of personal health benefits, but there are also some kind of community health benefits, which is really where public health sits. Mm-hmm. It is your own personal benefit, but it's also the cost of treatment to society, the loss to society when a variety of other behaviors that often go along with substance use occur. Does the public health literature really rely on these contingency management findings, or is that something that we have to continue to alert them to?
Well, I think probably more the latter. I think people like Ken Silverman and Maxine Stitzer at Hopkins, Steve Higgins at the University of Vermont, they're just doing tremendous work in terms of getting this out there into the public health domain. The Clinical Trials Network, which is a nationwide, interconnected network that delivers from academic medical centers out to communities. Maxine has worked with that network to get this out there to community clinics. So that's been tremendous success, I would say. The work of Nancy Petrie as well at the University of Connecticut. Unfortunately, she passed away. But her work has been just remarkable. She's got it into 94 outpatient drug clinics in the Veterans Administration across the country. And so it's considered now standard of care in these clinics.
That's
fantastic.
As
even just one VA system is a big system, right? But to get into the 94 is a big deal. So they've really been just very inspirational and effective in getting CM out there into the sort of a public health level.
Pat Fryman often says, hey, behavior analysts, you got to get in the mainstream. Come on in, the water's fine. This is very mainstream. This is something that adults struggle with, their health-related behaviors. And So the notion that we could get this kind of an intervention to a point where it's tailored enough and usable enough that it really can enter in that public health sector. This is your primary care delivery opportunity. And when you go to the doctor, you can, take care of your blood pressure and also take care of a program to stop smoking or to be accountable for that. So, our special series in JABA, it's not that other people can't read JABA, but we're obviously educating our JABA readers about public health, about some of the things that are happening, about their opportunity to potentially become involved in this. And then there's the flip side of that coin, where we also have to continue to educate the public health field about what we have to offer. So it's, how do you make choices about where you publish your stuff? I know you publish some of it in JABA, but I suspect you also choose some journals that are really going to get the word out to that public health audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, good question. I think in terms of choices, it depends on the particular study, the methods used. If I use, for example, a single case design versus a randomized controlled design. But I do prioritize a diverse range of publications, I would say, because I think a variety of audiences should have access to this. One randomized controlled trial we recently published in the journal Addiction, which is one of the more prestigious journals in that field. It's a primary motivation was to get it out there to a larger readership, including potentially, those that might be able to influence public policy. Not just read it for the science, but maybe they can start to become more educated about this and think about ways for reimbursement models to be developed around this. Steve Higgins has written a good amount about how Medicaid might be one avenue for reimbursement for a CM, given that it is cost effective. I mean, as you mentioned, if you can change someone's life from being drug dependent to non-drug dependent, you're reducing a whole host of other public health issues, not just the drug use, needle sharing, emergency room visits, arrests. So there's a whole host of downstream consequences that you're also preventing at the public health level.
So it strikes me that to get those public policy decisions in place, it would be important to be able to demonstrate that you can get the intervention to all of the people, right? Because when you're thinking about public policy decisions, one of the things that's probably important to policymakers is being able to get these tools in the hands of the people that need it. And if you say, well, this is going to be very effective and we can get this to 1% of the population, please make it a policy, when it applies to 14% of the population, which I think is the number that you gave for the current smoking percentage in the US, that might be less appealing. And I know that there are some barriers with contingency management to getting it broadly to everyone who needs it. So I wondered if you would be willing to talk about what some of those barriers might be, and how your team has been able to use technology to overcome some of those barriers or to address some of those barriers so that you can have the data necessary to influence the policymakers.
Yeah, that's a great question. Great. Our work has really kind of targeted the barriers to broad access to contingency management, especially for smoking cessation. A big one is just access. For smoking, we have to obtain breath carbon monoxide samples, and carbon monoxide is expelled pretty rapidly from the body. So you got to get 2 samples a day. There's a lot of early work showing that CM using this method profoundly influences smoking, but it was all in person. So either you have to go to them, drive out to where they are, or they have to come to you. And Claire, as I know you remember, there's no parking at the University of Florida, so it's really hard for them to get here. So back in the early 2000s, I was trying to solve this problem, and this was before smartphones, before broadband access even. And my idea was to just use technology, use a web camera to watch them provide CO samples. And it turns out that method works. We can, it's just like being there in person, essentially, and we can reach anyone. The recent clinical trial that I mentioned earlier, that was delivered to a nationwide sample remotely. So we never met with them in person at all. And so we were able to recruit smokers from over 26 states. We're going to expand on that. There's an NIH grant that's pending with some researchers at Oklahoma State, and we're planning on a randomized controlled trial with 535 socioeconomically disadvantaged smokers. And the idea behind that method is to completely automate all features of CM. So right now we have the collection of the CO sample automated, we have the delivery of the reinforcer automated, but we also have to verify the end user's identity because we're providing incentives. So we need to make sure that the person is the right person. So that feature will be automated with facial recognition software. So the idea is that once it's completely automated, that will further reduce costs, could make it more portable to, for example, being integrated into state level quit lines. So most states have tobacco funded quit lines where people can call and get support and nicotine replacement patches, for example. And maybe this could be part of that system and then therefore make a public health impact. I mean, I love the research we do. It's really fun and exciting when we publish our results, but my dream and the motivation behind all of this is to make it available like a nicotine patch. As easy as it is to open up a medicine cabinet, it should be easy to access evidence-based behavioral treatment as well. So technology, I think, can help with that for sure.
And I thought your approach in the study was really cool and a nice step towards that fully automated package. But not everybody has yet been able to read it that's listening to this podcast, I presume, although they all should. I wonder if you could tell the listeners a little bit about the basics of what you did and the variation of CM that's in your paper and what happened as a result of using that variation.
Yeah, so we developed this app. It was based on our earlier work using internet-based methods, but we developed an app, we called it Motivate, or M-Motivate, and the app collected objective evidence of abstinence using the breath carbon monoxide monitor. The monitor we used is a pretty cheap monitor as well, so that's important. It's right now it costs about $60. I know that they want to decrease the price point, make it available at Walgreens and CVS, so that anybody can use it. Use just the monitor, not the app. We integrated the monitor into the app, enrolled 14 smokers, and they received the treatment for 7 weeks. So what they did was they received 2 prompts per day, text-based prompts to leave a sample. They blew into the monitor. If they were below a cut point, in this case, it's 5 parts per million. That's the CO value. If they were below that cut point, they received a financial incentive that was put onto a debit card. We also used a multiple baseline design. So during baseline, only 4% of the samples were negative below the cut point. And then during treatment, 89% of the samples were negative. And we counted all missed samples as positive. So 89% is pretty good. And we also collected 85% of all the prompts that were scheduled, or all the samples that were prompted. I should say that, this was a short study. We really just wanted to demonstrate that we could do this. It was feasible. It was acceptable. That we could, initiate abstinence, but we did not look at long-term outcomes. So that wasn't part of the goals of the study, but it's definitely something that we will be doing with this larger R01 grant, because that's a needed data point.
Great. Well, Jesse, I know that you are a technology geek like me, or maybe a technophile is more what I should call myself, because I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but I like to get in the game and really help to design technology-based tools in the ABA space. And I know you have probably had to work for years with your partners at University of Florida to develop the technology side. I similarly had to do that with some virtual reality research that I did many years ago. What was that like? And did you learn anything from the technology side that informed your contingencies? I'm sure you had to teach them a lot about contingencies to get the app to work the way you want.
Yeah, great question. We got lucky. I mean, the initial software engineer that we worked with, Mike Rabinski, had been working with Ken Silverman for quite a number of years. So he was already very familiar with behavior and with operant psychology in general. So we were very lucky. He not only understood the software, he understood the behavior to a large extent. So he was great to work with. He informed a previous version of our motivated intervention in an important way. He was really keen on connecting smokers together online and having them support each other, work together to achieve goals. And that was he really thought that was exciting. And I thought, yeah, that is exciting. That sounds like a group contingency. So let's use some science-based procedures from group contingencies to do this very thing. And so that's what we did. And he was great about telling us what was possible in terms of how these groups of smokers could communicate via a discussion forum, that they could see each other's graph progress, for example, in real time. So some of those contingencies were his invention and through his encouragement. But in terms of the program contingencies for abstinence, I mean, those really did come from the literature, whether they were individual based, like in the smartphone app, or group based. So there was a little bit of a combination of the science, in terms of programming the contingencies, and then some of them were motivated through our early work with Mike Rabinski. So yeah, he was really fantastic to work with. And the group that we've been working with here at the University of Florida have been fantastic as well. And yeah, so it's nice to have the multidisciplinary team.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned that for people who have been smokers a long time, when they try to stop smoking, they're experiencing a lot of not only physiological symptoms, but probably if they have used the nicotine in their cigarettes to change how they momentarily feel. When they're anxious, when they're stressed, when they're hungry, what have you, it seems like they have to develop new behaviors, replacement behaviors that will help them manage those same things that aren't smoking a cigarette. Is there any way to use technology to add that in, kind of in addition to a group contingency, that notion of contingencies for other behaviors as opposed to just the abstinence?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we've thought a lot about. There are some challenges around that we haven't been able to address yet, but like objective evidence of the behavior change. to provide the incentive. But, for example, one thing that we've done is apply contingency management to physical activity like walking. And that could function as a replacement behavior for smoking, at least under some conditions. I mean, it's for some of the smokers we have in our studies, they don't live in a walkable neighborhood. So it's not feasible. But that could be one replacement behavior that could be reinforced, and we could obtain objective evidence through an accelerometer, for example. So we played around with those ideas, but it's certainly something we want to do more of, because you're right. I mean, what will replace the cigarettes, and can we generate those kinds of that kind of repertoire using technology that could promote potentially even longer term abstinence than what we've seen currently in the smoking cessation field.
That's a really interesting point. And one that I hadn't thought about is essentially you're running differential reinforcement of other behavior contingencies. And just like any time you run a DRO, you're not always certain what the O is going to be.
Right.
Something else is going to pop up into that behavioral vacuum, and you hope that it's something socially desirable or that is going to be habilitative for the person who's seeking behavior change.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, though, it's eating, which then makes it more punishing to stop smoking because they replace with food, and that can lead to other health problems.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Right. That's why physical activity is also a useful target in that area, because weight gain is a big concern, and it does occur. But physical activity could mitigate against that to some extent.
So, Jesse, I hope you'll let me loop back to your Motivate app for just a second. And so there are some features of the app that struck me in reading the paper that I'm not sure that the listeners would necessarily have picked up on in your description, which is that it graphs progress for people. And there's all of these really neat features of getting this immediate feedback that might make it more effective. So when I read about it, I did what I think many people will do, which is I am an iPhone user, and I popped on the App Store and I said, let me see it. So is this something that the listeners can go download and use and get involved with right now?
Yeah, if I were better at business, that it might be available, but I'm a scientist, not a business person. So the short answer is no. It's not available in a non-research context, at least not yet. I will say, though, we've worked with some researchers at RAND and a company called Way Better. And it's a technology-based CM program. And this it's called QuitBet. So listeners could go to quitbet.com and sign up for updates about QuitBet. And it works basically just like I've described for the smartphone-based app. Use a CO monitor, but you join a group of others in the context of a social game, essentially. And it's sort of a gamified version. So it's exciting and fun to participate. They've used this model with weight loss pretty successfully. Over 800,000 users so far. Something like $65 million in funds have been received for a weight loss. They use another feature, which is, I think, an interesting component, which is a deposit contract feature. So smokers leave a bit of their money. That's what's called quit bet. You bet. You leave some of your own money, and if you succeed, you earn it back, maybe plus the earnings of those who forfeit, or the forfeited earnings from smokers who didn't quit successfully. So it's a pretty good model. It's a business model, that works. And when you have a business model that works, that could potentially lead to broader accessibility and more of a public health impact. So that's a version that might be more accessible, at least in the near future.
Well, and I was excited to hear too that this is, readers should know, listeners should know that this isn't a one-off study for you, that this study is part of an ongoing line. And so I was excited to read the paper and then hear you reiterate on the podcast that you're continuing to develop these technologies and looking to fully automate it and bring in the facial recognition. So people who are interested in learning more about this should really kind of stay tuned to the literature, because these things may be on the market in more developed forms in the coming years, it sounds like.
Yep, that's certainly the hope. Yep. Absolutely.
One of the things I liked about your paper is, even though you created this specific Motivate app and technology, the paper really is about CM. So you have to describe carefully what you did and how it worked and what have you. But whether you get to the point where this app is ever commercially available or not, CM itself is the thing that created those effects. And so you're contributing to that literature on CM, not just a branded product. So if people do have access to other CM-based interventions, the effects might not be identical, but they should certainly be similar, same ballpark.
Absolutely. Yep.
So piggybacking on things to like about the study, one of the things that I really liked was that you measured not just the efficacy, but also social validity, because it seems like when we're trying to widely disseminate things, we're trying to influence public policy, social validity is as paramount, if not more paramount, than it is when we're doing individualized interventions. And you showed that your approach was efficacious for the majority of participants, and it was generally well liked. But there were some of the participants who were really successful. So I looked at your social validity data and I mapped those back onto the graphs, right? And what I was expecting was that the people who didn't see big behavior change would also be the same people who said, I found this kind of cumbersome. I didn't really like the prompts, which were two of, I think, the more common complaints that you report.
Right.
So I was really surprised when I did it. And I found that some of the really successful people were the same participants who didn't necessarily rate the intervention really highly. And there's this disconnect between efficacy and social validity. So I just wondered if you would give your impression about why you think it's important to look at social validity and how much people like an intervention, and what maybe some of the considerations for CM are in terms of making it more acceptable so that it is both acceptable and efficacious across that same wide array that you've demonstrated efficacy.
Yeah. Well, great eye, Claire, with respect to, looking at the acceptability and efficacy data. It's something that we've done for a while now, collect acceptability data, social validity data for all of our interventions. And generally people find that it's acceptable. They find it easy to use, it's convenient, useful. They'd recommend it to others, things like that. But sometimes there are some features of the intervention that they don't like, even if they're successful. I think in early stage technology-based research, there are glitches, and that's kind of unavoidable. So that's one feature that could certainly decrease acceptability, and that's something that we can improve upon, as our research and development proceeds. But in other cases, they want more than just the CM. These smokers experience quite a bit of stress in their lives, which we also wrote about, losing loved ones being hospitalized, serious family conflict. There was a major hurricane here in Florida. So there's a lot going on, and our app does not provide much more than the CM, which certainly helps them quit, but they want more. And I think that's really important to take into consideration in terms of building a better mousetrap, as it were, because public health impact is the product of efficacy and reach. You have to have both, and part of that is acceptability to get broader reach. So I think as important as efficacy is acceptability. And so we do have more work to do along those lines, and that's what we're doing. Our next iteration will improve upon the technology. We'll be delivering more treatment components in addition to CM to provide that kind of tailored support that they're looking for.
And regardless of your area of practice, I think it's worth remembering that just because it works doesn't mean that people will like it.
Right.
And if they don't like it, their likelihood of adopting it is lower. And if they don't adopt it, it's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So all of these are very interrelated constructs. And I think sometimes I talk to people who appear to be really focused on the efficacy piece, and they just kind of assume like, well, your behavior problem is fixed, so therefore you will like this and you will want to do it in the future. And right. I think what you said about this idea of both efficacy and reach is so paramount for everything that we do.
Absolutely.
Trying to disseminate science and make the world a better place.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, could not agree more.
Jesse, have you guys looked into combine, when you're thinking like these people want more, and certainly there's, I think you speculate on a couple of the things that in the paper, but have you looked at motivational interviewing as a component for treatment? I just did a interview that I haven't released yet with someone from the University of Memphis, and they're having a lot of great success with curbing at least the intensity of drinking, both with college kids and young people more generally, with just some brief motivational interviewing, like an hour, just having people right. kind of talk about, their drinking patterns and, the natural consequences to indulging too much, et cetera, et cetera. Could you see that being something that would add to and augment the treatment of CM?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We have thought about motivational interviewing, also acceptance and commitment therapy as another possibility, but we have not done so yet. I mean, the idea would be to address some of these other behavioral mechanisms involved, that CM does not really target, like explicitly learning new skills and enhancing other dimensions of a person's repertoire that might result in longer term abstinence. So that's certainly a next step. I mean, in our next iteration, it will be much more integrated with cognitive behavioral therapy and also nicotine replacement therapy as well. Motivational interviewing, I think that would be very useful to look at. And it's a nice intervention too, because you can get something with a relatively brief intervention, like a 1 hour motivational interviewing session.
Agreed. Yeah. And, you also can take that approach of there are lots of different apps out there that are currently available and in use for things like a 1-minute meditation. Mm-hmm. There are, I don't know that they're available on app, but there are actually cognitive behavior therapy for anxiety, depression, stress, online modules available. And if you can be in a position to have your app refer people to these other functions rather than having to build it directly into your app, that might get you to those support functions right. A little more quickly. So there are several of those available if you're thinking of it as an add-on rather than a critical part that's related to your prompting schedule and testing schedule and what have you.
Yeah, it's a great point. We've actually done that in other internet-based versions of our intervention and referred them to, for example, smokefree.com, and that's the NCI's, National Cancer Institute's platform, which offers, if anybody's a smoker that's a listener, I would recommend it. There's a lot of content there that's very tailored. So there are many different versions of the smoke-free site based on what kind of smoker you are. So we have referred people to that site, and some have found it helpful, but we have not found any differences in outcomes based on those that use it versus those that don't. But I think we're limited by, to some extent, by sample size. To see these effects, you need pretty large samples.
Great. Well, so this is probably no surprise to you or any of the listeners, but we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And one of the interesting things that I've heard in several news stories is that just within the span of the last year, we are seeing greater numbers of students pursuing classes, degrees, and careers in public health areas that they have, which could range in anything from epidemiology to nursing and a variety of different kind of wellness related areas, or things like smoking and weight loss and that kind of thing. So if we're seeing this surge towards people want to be involved in public health, maybe we could, as behavior analysts, have something to offer if behavior analysts are interested in following that surge and capitalizing. What should a behavior analyst do if they want to do some work in public health? How would they get started in this?
Yeah, I heard some of that reporting about public health and the surge in numbers. I think it's really interesting. You look at COVID, for example, and in terms of addressing it, it's mostly behavioral. That's in our wheelhouse, and that's true for just about, most of the causes of early death in the developed world are behavioral in nature. Cigarette smoking, medication non-adherence. And so there's a really good article by Schroeder in the New England Journal of Medicine where he talked about how now the greatest or the single greatest opportunity to improve health and reduce premature death is in personal behavior. And so what that means is, we got to look at the large systemic structural problems, that like advertising, tobacco advertising to teens and food deserts and things like that. And also the contingencies responsible for unhealthy behavior. So there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we have to offer, I think. In terms of how to do that, behavior analysts could get a degree in public health, take their expertise with them, for sure. We have several students doing that here at UF, actually, as part of their doctoral studies. So I think that's fantastic.
And there's so much to learn from that kind of degree, not only with respect to, new methodologies. I think, one of our barriers has been that behavior analysts have not used large-scale methodologies for the most part, and many don't seem to have interest in them, when in fact it's really, as Sid Bijou almost 70 years ago now said, it's not about there being good and bad methodologies. It's about the appropriateness of your methods for answering the question that you try to answer. And some of these, most of our health behaves multiple controlling variables at any given time. And a lot of those controlling variables are contextualized in what we might think of as the most broad definition of our environment, including the marketing campaigns and investments of the people trying to sell us products. And so have your students mentioned kind of what they're finding interesting about what they're encountering in their public health degrees?
Yeah, I think just sort of what things that you've just suggested. I think that they're learning that there is so much to learn in public health, where we could apply some of our technologies with respect to, say, direct observation, for example. Rearranging contingencies is another. New target behaviors, like, for example, egg consumption in impoverished environments. Egg consumption can be a powerful way to address malnutrition. But how to do that? What are the antecedents that need to be addressed? What are the consequences that need to be addressed? So they've, I think, found it very exciting to go into this new field because there are new problems. And, I think I should also mention, even though we understand the role of contingencies in changing behavior, I think that it's really important to approach these new areas with a degree of humility. Nicole Gravina, my colleagues here at UF, Nicole Gravina and Christy Alligood wrote a great paper in Behavior Analysis and Practice where they talked about branching out, and I think it's really important, and they emphasize to be humble, and because there's a lot to learn from public health as well. And so, it's probably in these times, especially, it's kind of nice to think about working together and in unity and solving some complex problems.
Humble and curious. Be as eager to learn from this new area as you are excited to bring them some knowledge. And, after decades training people to kind of explore behavioral gerontology, even as a second interest, if not their first, I think that's something that you see anytime we branch out. Don't assume that you understand all the intricacies of an aging body in a way that you need to coming in without that background, and just be eyes wide open and ears open to hear about all of this new information, because it will likely lead you to new insights, even about behavior analysis. Certainly, those experiences really enhanced my understanding of stimulus control with older adults with dementia. And so by doing that, I actually learned more about behavior analysis, as well as learning a lot more about the topics themselves of, health and aging and what have you. And I hope your students are having that same exciting experience, because there are lots of ways for us to do good in the world. And I'm so happy to see you representing some of those ways in JABA. So folks, please do take a look at Jesse's article in the upcoming issue of JABA. And then in the following issue, be on the lookout for a great review paper on public health and behavior analysis and public health that Jesse will be writing with Matt Normand. It's been such a pleasure to have you here today. And Matt, do you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I just, Jesse, I'd like to thank you for coming and chatting with us about this. It's a really important topic. And as we alluded to earlier in the show, that CM is going to be something that's new to a lot of the listeners. So it's always fun to show people something new about behavior analysis. Even though CM's been around for a while, it's not really been at the, I guess, in the mainstream of what we would consider typical ABA. I'll, kind of use the air quotes with that. So, and that's one of the fun things about doing the show, is being able to share some of the neat things that we do in this field that might be a little not as well represented in the again, mainstream circles. So for all that and more, thank you very much. If there's questions that people have, do you have a website or that people can go? You don't need to give your email address out over the air here, but if there's a place that people can find you, feel free to share with me either now, or I can put it in the show notes for this episode.
Yeah, probably the easiest thing people could do is just Google my name, and my UFL webpage will appear. Should be one of the first results. I think that's the best way to get to the website.
All right, very good. Okay, so Claire, Linda, and Jesse, thanks so much for joining me in this 6th edition of the Inside JABA Series.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.